It's Star Wars Day, and despite the temptation to do yet another video denying Admiral Ackbar's death, he isn't dead, by the way. We're going to focus on an entirely different group of characters this year. Today we're talking droids. No, not the 80s animated series. The class of beings? Things? Rubbish bins on wheels that beep and boop a lot? And that's kind of the point. What do droids count as? Are droids people? Or to put it in mildly more coherent wording, are droids sentient? First up, what the hell do I even mean by sentient? There are a ton of definitions that you can find, starting with Merriam-Webster defining sentient as capable of sensing or feeling, conscious of or responsive to the sensations of seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, or smelling. Whereas Cambridge Dictionary goes with a much vaguer, able to experience feelings. Generally, most definitions involve feeling stuff and having negative and positive reactions. Droids definitely appear to feel things, but there is a difference between having actual feelings and program responses. Probably. Maybe? That's kind of the whole thing, isn't it? So if dictionaries don't help, what about the law? Using UK law as an example, there isn't really a direct legal definition of sentience. Instead, the Animal Welfare (Sentience) Bill pretty much just lists what counts as sentient. In this case, that includes any vertebrate other than Homo sapiens, any cephalopod mollusk, or any decapod crustacean. This legislation exists to ensure that the fact that these animals have feelings is accounted for when new laws and legislation are being drafted. But what does the law say about artificial intelligence? Well, not a whole lot. The law doesn't recognise artificial sentience, and there's no real provision for how sentience could be considered, proven, or even really defined. Like I said, the law seems to prefer listing what counts as sentient, rather than trying to come up with a big legal definition for it. The way AI is going, it's not outside the realms of possibility that the law may have to start taking clearer stance on the idea of artificial sentience, whether that is for or against it. So the concept of sentience seems like it may come down to people's individual interpretations of what sentient means and how feelings really work. To some, a machine could never truly experience feelings. They'd just be digital replications of emotions. To others, real feelings are just a series of electrical signals and chemical reactions anyway, and the distinctions between those and simulated feelings aren't quite as big. Perhaps sentience isn't the question to answer here then. Perhaps it's instead a question of intelligence. When we question sentience, it's like we're trying to find the dividing line between different types of living creatures, separating humans and animals from things like plants and microorganisms. When it comes to droids though, they don't really fit into that category to begin with. So instead of seeing if they can feel things, we should really be asking, can machines think? And that is the exact question Alan Turing was asking in 1950 when he devised what is now referred to as the Turing test. The basic idea is this: you have one interviewer and two subjects. Of the two subjects, one is a human and one is a computer. The interviewer then has a conversation with each of them without knowing which is which. If the interviewer can't tell which is which, the computer passes the Turing test. Over the years, the Turing test has been updated and altered as technology and our understanding of artificial intelligence improves. But the base idea of the test remains: can a machine convince someone that they are a person? Some early computers, such as ELIZA in 1966, claimed to be able to fool some humans. However, critics of those early successes argue that the full criterion controls of the Turing test weren't met. Since 1950, the Turing test has been used in several competitions to judge how successful things like chatbots are at replicating humans. Between 1991 and 2019, the Loebner Prize was a competition where chatbots would have conversations with 4 different judges for 25 minutes. The prize was then awarded to the program that received the most votes from those judges. In 2014, to mark the 60th anniversary of Alan Turing's passing, Kevin Warwick at the University of Reading organised a competition, during which a chatbot called Eugene Goostman, mimicking a 13-year-old boy, convinced 33% of judges that they were actually a human, technically passing the Turing test. Also, the reason why they chose to mimic a 13-year-old boy was essentially to try and get the chatbot a pass if it messed something up, because, oh, it's a 13-year-old boy. He's just going to get things wrong. And I can already hear several of you asking, what about ChatGPT? Well, a study from February 2024 claimed that ChatGPT-4 passed the Turing test by showing behavioural and personality traits that are statistically indistinguishable from a random human from tens of thousands of human subjects. ChatGPT was asked a series of predetermined questions, and its responses were compared to those given by randomly sampled human responses and scored on 5 personality traits. Now, all of this sounds promising as a way of figuring out if droids are alive, but that's because I haven't mentioned the many issues with the Turing test and Turing test competitions. There are a lot of critics of the Turing test, pointing out that the stringent controls on how the test needs to be conducted limit the scope of the test. Merely having a simple conversation with someone doesn't allow all forms of intelligence to be considered, and only really shows that the bot is able to respond in the way it was programmed. Take ChatGPT. Rather than being independently intelligent, it's able to regurgitate the information already created by actual humans that it has taken, and most likely stolen without permission, from a dataset. It's almost as if someone in the 1950s wouldn't have had the knowledge to understand how, to test AI that gets developed decades later. And we're likely in a similar situation now. We can't devise a system to test the intelligence of fully autonomous AI because we haven't made it yet. It's entirely possible that we won't know that we've made something quote-unquote alive until we've already done it. If we say he tried the Turing test on C-3PO, he'd pass with ease. He'd pass any sort of intelligence test we come up with, because we don't understand how to make and test an AI that complex. Even then, the question of machine consciousness may be more of a philosophical question than a scientific one. So rather than asking science, let's ask science fiction. So sci-fi is full of stories about robots and AI and if they're truly alive, and there are far too many for me to attempt listing all of them here. So here's just a few examples from stuff I like. Right, start off with I can't talk about robots in sci-fi without mentioning Isaac Asimov. His collection of short stories laid the groundwork for where a lot of robotics would go in science fiction. A lot of Asimov stories involve confronting the Frankenstein complex of robots, where people view them as monsters to be afraid of. And in the stories, the robots would often have to try to come to terms with this Frankenstein complex. Asimov also introduced his very famous 3 laws of robotics. Number 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Number 2, a robot must obey the orders given it by a human being, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And number 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Some people take these to be the perfect laws that we should be using when making robots, but the stories themselves, and notably the 2004 film of the same name, show how imperfect these laws can be upon interpretation. Asimov himself didn't even seem to think he'd come up with something of note. Instead, it was just common sense put into simple words. He even played around with the laws in his stories, including the suggestion of a 0th law. A robot may not injure humanity or through inaction allow humanity to come to harm, where a robot could harm a human in order to protect humanity as a whole. Right, we'll ignore the whole Earth actually being a supercomputer thing and instead focus on Marvin the paranoid android, because if giving an android mental health issues isn't trying to claim a robot is alive, I don't know what is. Then again, Marvin's depression is an intentionally programmed part of his personality through the Genuine People Personalities technology, once again blurring the line between humanity and code. Right, this is a simple one. If you watched WALL-E and didn't think the film's message was this little guy's alive, you weren't paying attention. A more modern example, Detroit's entire premise is asking the exact question we're asking here. And more often than not, the game lands on the side that the robots are as alive as the humans, or at least have the potential to be. The game also treats the robots becoming sentient as a binary sort of thing, where they're either deviant or not, and that change happens in a moment where they disobey their programming. The world of Futurama is filled with robots with their own personalities and culture, but who cares about all of them when Bender's right there? Despite his own protest against such an idea, the show repeatedly shows Bender is as alive and aware as all the other characters. Just as an example, there's an episode where Bender has to come to terms with his own mortality. Age of Ultron actually gives quite a good example of how the same story can treat artificial intelligence differently, depending on the actions of the AI. Age of Ultron introduces us to the Vision, who from then on is basically treated as a person, despite being primarily synthetic, though the Mind Stone does complicate things a little bit. However, Ultron doesn't really get this same treatment. He's treated as a rogue piece of code who just needs to be deactivated without remorse. Obviously, his genocidal tendencies may have justified this lack of remorse, though. Between LMDs, Chronocoms, and LMDs made of Chronocom tech, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. covered robots quite a few times. But beyond the usual can robots be sentient question, by the final season they were questioning what makes a person by having an artificial replica of Phil Coulson implanted with all of his memories, and questioning, who does that make the robot? Was the robot Phil Coulson? Is it a separate person? You get the predicament. Right, come on, I had to add this one in. Modern FNAF's main villain is an AI made to mimic everything it sees, though it's never really been viewed as being sentient. And for years, the animatronics, no matter how fancy their AI was, were never really viewed as being alive beyond the spirits possessing them. That being until we got to these guys, most importantly Glamrock Freddy, who might be being treated as a sentient AI, or he might be possessed, but this isn't a FNAF theory video, I do enough of those already. But what do all these and all the other similar stories say about whether robots are quote-unquote alive? Well, it's rare to find a story that specifically lands on the side that robots can never be sentient, no matter how aware or intelligent they become. However, a decent amount of stories prefer to dodge the question entirely, and look more at humanity's relationship with AI. And that's not a complaint. It's much more difficult to make stories with super advanced AI accurate and relatable, because we don't have sentient AI in reality, and any version of it in the story will be open to the interpretation of the storyteller. It's also a lot easier to tell stories from the perspective of humans than from that of sentient robots, given there are people, but there aren't sentient robots. Stories do also tend to treat AI differently depending on its actions. Good AI is much more likely to be portrayed as sentient than AI which does bad things, even if they show near identical levels of awareness and intelligence. Right, finally, it's time to actually talk about Star Wars in a Star Wars video. Star Wars has had many ups and downs when it comes to treating droids like people, so let's just run through a handful of them. This felt like the Clone Wars' attempt at discussing this very question. D-Squad consisted almost entirely of droids, except for Colonel Neba Gascon, who, over the course of the story, goes from treating the droids like tools to actually seeing them as his comrades. In a show like the Clone Wars, which likes to impart wisdom onto the viewer, this feels like a very intentional message. So this moment in The Rise of Skywalker frames it as though C-3PO is dying by having his memories erased. It's a really heartfelt moment until A, it gets undone later in the same film, and B, we remember we've literally seen 3PO have his memory completely wiped before, between episodes 3 and 4. My point here is that it's inconsistent framing. In one case, a droid's memory getting wiped is them essentially dying, which makes sense, but we've seen droids have their memory wiped before, without this same question of morality in it. So in one episode of Rebels, we get Chopper wanting something for himself, making his own decisions, making a friend, removing a restraining bolt from AP5 so that he can also make his own decisions, and he stole the freight transport. Basically, Chopper's showing a lot of free will, and he's only committing a few crimes in the process. And back to the exact opposite. The battle droids have one purpose: get destroyed. They are just cannon fodder for the good guys. There's no questioning the morality of their destruction. Right, I can't go through talking about droids without at least a quick mention of these two as a pair. They've been there in some capacity for basically the entire story. You know, except for, like, the Acolyte. Give me a season 2! I also had to bring up my favourite droid into this somehow. But if you've read the Aftermath trilogy and read about Mr. Bones and Temmin Wexley, and came away from that not thinking that Mr. Bones counts as a person, you've got a heart made of stone. And that is coming from someone who's been called an emotionless robot by multiple people. The droids rights activist. The one time a Star Wars film actually confronted this question in any regard. And it's kind of treated as a bit of a joke. So yet again, a bit of both from Star Wars. So, Star Wars is inconsistent on whether it wants to treat droids as people, and much like other media, it sort of depends on what side the droids are on. However, it's also people on the different sides that treat the droids differently, with the bad guys mistreating them, whereas the good guys treat them with generally more respect. The best examples of the good guys caring about their droids are people like Anakin, Hera, or again Snap Wexley. In each case, this caring nature is portrayed as a positive characteristic. For one extra note though, we could say, ask George Lucas. Now, he has stated before that he doesn't see the droids as having souls and are merely programming, but he has likened R2-D2 to being the Lassie of Star Wars. So perhaps Star Wars sees droids less as people and more on a par with animals, just often much more intelligent. The other note is that L337's activism was supposedly based on a George Lucas idea. Well, it reframes a lot of what we see in Star Wars. There are droids everywhere, but barring a few notable names, a lot of them are treated less like characters and more like mobile iPads. If we instead look at droids as people, it gives us all sorts of opportunities to tell stories around the lives of droids and their place in the galaxy. Opportunities that Star Wars sometimes runs with, and sometimes they just want some cannon fodder and ignore them. You know who droids are treated a lot like? Clones. But before we got the Clone Wars. And we've had some of the best Star Wars when the clones were treated like actual autonomous people. Yes, droids are programmed, but so were the clones in a way. Bred and taught from birth to be good soldiers who follow orders. From a storytelling standpoint, just discussing the idea of droid sentience has shown it can be really compelling. And it's a story Star Wars has all the potential in the world to tell, yet seems to keep nearly telling, but not going all in. Star Wars has some of the most, if not the most, iconic fictional robots. perhaps it's time for some droid-centric stories. Look, answering whether computers can be alive and how we'd even determine that is a much more complex subject than a short Star Wars Day special can cover. But just for fun, let's look at some of the ideas that can come from treating droids as people in Star Wars. So, if we start treating droids as people, that surely means droids have to follow the law. In which case, Chopper's screwed. Like, we all like to make the Chopper war criminal jokes. But if he actually could be treated as a war criminal, oh no! So I have brought up memory wipes and restraining bolts, but if you look at both of those in the context of droids being people, it's kind of screwed up. Like, you're entirely erasing someone's memory, or you're literally taking away their free will. Yeah, I can kind of get why L337 gets a bit pissed off at that. So at the end of the Clone Wars, obviously there's a whole droid army that they need to do something with. And it just all immediately gets shut off. It sends out a shutdown command. And in the context of droids being people, that's kind of genocide-y. Like, I wanted to find a more, like, safe, nice word to use for it, but, like, if they're people, you've just wiped them all out with the press of a button. I can't think of a better word. If they're people, could droids use the Force? I mean, could they anyway? Like, the Kyber crystals themselves are sort of, like, sentient and Force sensitive. If a little, like, rock can be sentient and use the Force in some way, why not a droid? Like, think of all the war crimes Chopper could do with the Force. But for my final point, if droids are people, droids can belong to families. In which case, Rey is not the last Skywalker, because C-3PO is kind of unambiguously a Skywalker to me. Like, he was literally made by Anakin. He spent so much of his life around the Skywalker family. C-3PO is a Skywalker to me. Heck, you could make the case for R2 being a Skywalker as well. He's essentially Anakin's brother. And yes, this entire video, the purpose of it was essentially me trying to make the case that C-3PO counts as a Skywalker. But that wraps up my Star Wars Day video, where I basically, wanted to explain how I think C-3PO is a Skywalker. It's an important fact to remember, just as much as it's important to remember that Admiral Ackbar's not dead. May the Force be with you, and I'll see you when you're older.